Hello everyone and welcome to the IFST Sensory Science Group webinar, Conducting Sensory and Consumer Research During Lockdown. My name is Stephanie Mitchell and I'm the chair of the IFST Sensory Science Special Interest Group. The group allows members interested in sensory science to engage and share knowledge with fellow professionals. We cover a wide range of topics relating to the sensory properties of food and drink, including sensory testing and analysis, consumer trends, neuroscience, the impact of social networking, and health and wellness. We are also involved in accreditation and examination of sensory training and the review and promotion of ethical and professional standards. This webinar is fourth in a series, replacing our planned June conference, which has been cancelled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Please keep an eye on the IFST's events page for more details of the next webinar. Feel free to make comments and ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. There will be a question and answer session after the presentation, where we will respond to as many of these questions as possible. And Carol Ryather, who is one of our SSG events team, will be asking these questions. So today we have three speakers for you, all of whom are experts in their field, and they will take you through highlights of their experiences, adaptations and considerations for running quality research during these unprecedented times. Our first speaker is Phiala Mehring, who is Research Director at MMR, and she joined when there were only 4 people there and has seen it grow to an international company. In 2007, she was asked to set up the Sensory Science Centre at Reading University and now manages all of MMR's UK sensory panels, including several client panels, and oversees the panels in Shanghai and Singapore. And she will be talking about innovation from lockdown. Our second speaker is Dr. Jean McEwan, and she's a globally recognised expert in sensory and consumer science field, with a career spanning over 30 years. Jean is passionate about ensuring studies are designed to address the research questions, with an eye on what data analysis tools will be required. She enjoys adapting methodology, and her talk will be about test design and data analysis outcomes, moving from the CLT to the home. Our final speaker is Annika Ipsen, and she is Senior Sensory Professional at ISI Sensory Marketing Research, which is based in Germany. Annika started working there in 2012 and has managed a variety of different panels for many years before she moved her focus to sensory consumer testing and product optimization studies. Her talk will be on can high-quality results of lab profiling also be achieved when testing in-home. So without further ado, I will hand you over to our first speaker today, who is Phiala. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction. So I'm going to talk to you about the innovations that have come from moving the panel to working at home during lockdown. So as per the introduction, I'm Phiala, and I've worked at MMR for a long time. There were just 4 of us when I started, and there are now 150 plus all around the globe. And of course, we have our sensory panels as well. My job is looking after the UK panels, both MMR1 and our client panels, as well as having oversight for the Shanghai and the Singapore panels, again, both MMR panels and our client panels, which means that I've been very heavily involved in moving panels to working at home and now moving them back. If you asked me what was the one thing that I really learned from COVID-19, it would be innovate, innovate, innovate. Having spent February in Singapore, I kind of saw the writing on the wall. So that when I came home in early March, we put everything in place to move the panel home. And we actually got our first sessions in home in the week beginning the 16th of March. I have clients telling me that that makes us the first in the world to be working from home. I'm sure you'll correct me on that. We built this on our out-of-the-lab methodology. So for many years now, we've done a lot of data capture at home, whether that be for temporal reasons, a 6-hour assessment of a product, or actually because the product could only be evaluated in the home. But this was all scoring. So we took this and we pushed it to the very max. And again, like many of you, I suspect, moved our panels onto working on Teams with data capture at home as well, because it was important to us, essential to us, that we still are able to supply our clients with the outputs they needed for their product development, optimization, and other things. And we moved all our client panels home too. So what research have we conducted at home? To be fair, everything. We've done conventional QDA, we've done temporal profiling, qualitative mapping, TDS, difference tests. That actually was quite a headache logistically. And deconstructing the user experience, and more in a moment about that. And as I say, our panels worked home because it was very important to MMR that our clients weren't ending up in a position with a huge backlog of sensory projects to do when they got back into the lab. And all of this applies both to MMR's QDA approach, but also to Spectrum. So at the very beginning, I said, what have I learned about running panels at home? Well, to quote David, with an excellent panel, you can get excellent data from a car park setting. And in fact, at one point we did have a discussion session in a car park setting when the panel were collecting the samples. But what about all those necessary standardised conditions? Well, we worked very hard to retain those as much as possible where they were required. And that's really important because that is one of the learnings from moving the panel home, that they're not always required. We delivered products when required, blind coded in identical containers. Now that simple sentence belies the huge amount of work that was involved in that, as I suspect you, colleagues and team members will have told you. It took and takes a lot of time. We had strict protocols were applied and the panel leader observing the panel working at all times. With our training data, we were not just checking it for poor performance, we were actually checking it to make sure that the panelists' home conditions were not impacting their data. And we did little simple tricks, like getting the panel to all work by a window and work at the same time so that we had somewhat similar lighting conditions, or putting products into deep dark pots to mask visual cues because we couldn't have red lighting. But the bottom line was we couldn't really see impacts on the outputs we were generating, and even more so the longer we are doing, so therefore our clients are not seeing problems with the diagnostics that we are supplying them. And we were able to prove quite early on that the data was good. This is a project that started in the lab in August 2019 and continued at home in March and April of this year. And so that we could check that the panel were being consistent, we put 2 double-blind samples in there, as it were, samples from the previous round, and they weren't exactly, that scored exactly the same, but then we're talking about human beings here, and things aren't scored exactly the same even in the lab. But we were very pleased that the panel was falling within the parameters that were required. So if innovation has been the biggest learning for me, what has that actually been? Well, by having the panels working at home, we were able to build on some of the projects that we've been doing that actually deconstruct important elements of those products through everyday use. That is, the user experience. For example, think of tissues, the softness of tissues. Now that is not just, as we all know, the feel between the fingers and sensation on the cheeks. The perception of softness in tissues for consumers will start from the box. And we've done a lot of research to show, working with the panels and consumers, that something like orange juice, the same orange juice in different cartons, different shaped cartons, will impact the perception of sweetness. It'll impact the perception of softness. What about the sound of the tissue coming out of the box, the dust it makes? What about how the tissue falls apart when you put it in your back pocket and move it around for a day or two? All those things will be involved in the perception of softness. What about the pitch and tone of electrical equipment? And a challenge here to you when you go and put your kettle on is go and listen to all the noises that a kettle makes, that it communicates with you. the noises of picking it up and putting it down and filling it with water, the lid closing, turning it on, the pitch and tone of the boil, that will all speak to the consumer about quality, about efficiency and efficacy. What about product ergonomics? Yes, of course we can do that in the lab, but it's much more powerful if you objectively deconstruct that at home. So for me, the real innovation of COVID-19 is realising that actually panels are precisely the right people to be objectively deconstructing the user experience at home. I'd now like to hand over to Jean.
Thank you, Phiala. And now I'm going to look at some of the test design and data analysis outcomes when moving from CLT to the home. Here we're looking at some of the points of differentiation between the two test locations. In terms of product testing, the CLT is often sequential monadic. It has more controlled test conditions, but of course, if the home is the normal context, the results might be more relevant. The CLT is more likely to be interview-led, the respondents more focused. You're going to get faster results from a CLT, therefore making it more cost-effective. In terms of dropouts, if you have a pre-recruitment, possibly more from a home use test, and that could well impact the representativeness of your final consumer sample. Thinking about product security, you have more control over the product information in a CLT compared to the home use test. Now let's have a look at impact on results. Some papers report more discrimination in a central location test, possibly due to focus on the products. However, if the home is the normal context of consumption, then these results may be more relevant. Liking scores have also been reported as lower in a central location test, but this is not so noticeable for samples presented in the first position. Considering the central location test is more controlled, smaller sample size is generally required to detect a specified difference. There is some evidence that more verbatim comments are obtained from consumers in a central location test compared to the home use. And as we've said earlier, the CLT is less relevant to real life. However, if the home is not the usual context, then of course we have the same issues in terms of relevance of the outcomes. Differences between the CLT and home use test are product dependent, and there's many publications that demonstrate this. Reaction to some products is more impacted by context than others. And of course, the results can also be impacted if a product is not specific to a single and most common context. So again, we need to think about how the results will be impacted when we move from the home use testing environment compared to the CLT. I'm now going to summarise some of the test design considerations. If your product is likely to have higher within-product variation within a home use test, then you need to think about a larger consumer base size in order to obtain the required level of discrimination. As we mentioned earlier, if the home is the usual context in which the product is consumed, the level of discrimination is likely to be realistic to that context. However, if home use is not the context, you need to think about how this will impact the discrimination that you obtain. Test objective is also important. So are you doing a pair comparison, hedonic ratings, monadic, sequential monadic, and are you doing a single cell or multiple respondent cells? All these factors will impact on the sample size. So what size of difference is likely to be meaningful? And again, we come back to what base size is required to demonstrate discrimination between the samples. And this is not just about CLT versus home use, but also the method chosen. So you're likely to require more respondents for a pure monadic test versus a sequential monadic. Finally, what is the impact of a balanced design not being achieved due to many non-completions? So for example, if you had more non-users than users of the product, then this could lead to misleading outcomes. Finally, let's have a quick look at some outcomes from the literature. On a study on regular and diet beverages, the authors concluded discrimination between the two products was similar between the home use and CLT, but the scores were higher in the home. They also conducted quite an extensive literature review, and they noted that lichen scores tended to be lower in standardised conditions for both CLT and lab. A couple of years later, they undertook multiple studies on milk beverage, salted crackers, and sparkling water brands. Again, the lichen scores were higher when tested at home compared to the CLT. However, this discrimination between products was impacted by the product type, and the authors hypothesised that this could be due to the way in which the products are normally eaten. So, for example, crackers, you normally put something on them. They also noted that the outcomes are impacted depending on whether pure monadic versus sequential monadic data are used, finding less discrimination in the pure monadic condition, and they felt that this could be partly impacted by sample size and/or the ability to differentiate only in a comparative context. Thank you for your attention, and now I'm going to pass on to Annika.
Thank you, Jean. So far, we heard about innovations from lockdown and moving CLTs to home use testing. I will talk a little bit about moving descriptive panels into home profiling and the question if results from in-home testing are comparable to highly standardized lab testing, and show you results from a direct comparison of both approaches. My name is Annika Ipsen, and I'm a senior sensory professional at ISI for almost 9 years now. ISI is one of Europe's leading agencies in sensory marketing research and innovation consultancy. We are combining the best of two worlds, the classic full-service market research, qualitative and quantitative, and classic sensory research on the other side with consumer tests and descriptive analysis by our expert panels. Our main location is in Göttingen, Germany, and we have further sensory labs for CLT testing and sensory profiling in Munich and Hamburg, but we are operating worldwide with reliable partners all around the globe. The descriptive analysis is an important tool that helps product developers to create the best recipe in all its sensory characteristics. A group of experts is trained on a certain product category to objectively evaluate a product based on their sensory characteristics. So the experts work as measuring devices. And this can not only be applied for food or beverages, where the flavor is most often the main focus, but also for cosmetics, household care, packaging, or even industrial design. The foundation of descriptive analysis is the focus of detecting differences coming from the product itself. The golden rule of descriptive analysis is to guarantee a highest level of standardization to provide a high internal validity. This starts with a standardized storage of the products, a standardized preparation of the products, controlled tasting environment, usually in a sensory lab, with constant temperature, same light conditions, no disturbing environment like undesired room odor, noise, etc., and tasting and evaluation of the products needs to follow an exact protocol by all panelists. Well, this golden rule of standardization needed to be loosened due to Corona, or for at least a certain extent now. The lockdown in Germany hit us more or less by surprise, and we had to stop all CLT and panel activities immediately. But many of our clients had ongoing or planned projects with highest priorities and important company decisions to be made based on the results of our descriptive work. Despite the sudden lockdown, we had to react creative to find a solution to keep the projects going, be flexible because our experts were not allowed to enter our labs, but still continue the work with as much standardization as possible. And of course, the most important issue at this point, keep our staff and experts and everybody safe and healthy. Just to name some of the points that we had to take into consideration. The panelists needed to agree to participate under the given circumstances. The hygienic standards in the lab were already very high, but we needed to ensure the maximum distance between our lab staff. Planning of the logistics and how to get the samples to the panelists was also very challenging. We needed to ensure every panelist is equipped with the needed technology at home. Then we had to check if the samples are suitable for testing at home. Juice and cookies are easy, but what about hot beverages like coffee, convenient food, or ice cream? Detailed instructions for every panel individually needed to be handed out to the panelists. And the big question, how can we keep the profiling as standardized as possible, and can we rely on the data later? Here are just a few impressions on how we handled the situation at ISI in Göttingen. The samples were prepared under the same standardized conditions as usual and packed in boxes for our panelists. The samples were prepared fresh for every day of the evaluation. The panelists received a time window to pick up the products, including all necessary test equipment like plates, glasses, knives, tablets, palette cleansers, and thermometers. Heated products were handed out in thermo boxes and had to be evaluated immediately at home, while chilled products had to be refrigerated again at home for 1 hour. Our panelists received exact instructions on how to conduct the home profiling, and they sent us pictures of their working stations. Many of our panelists work for us already for over 10 years and have a high commitment to us and the work they are doing. They know about the importance of standardization, and all of them did a fantastic job of following our instructions and doing their evaluation as standardized as possible. And now we come to the most important question. How can we be sure that the results are reliable? Can we trust the data from home profiling? And are the results comparable to our results from the highly standardized lab profiling? To answer these questions, the luck was on our side. Usually in our studies, every sample is measured 2 or 3 times in a randomized order by the panelists to increase the sample size and to check for the panel performance. In one project with 17 dairy products over a period of 8 weeks, the first measurement still took place in our lab. The second measurement had just started in the lab with 1 session, but then continued in home profiling. So we had a complete data set from lab results from the first measurement and could compare them to an almost complete data set of home profiling. The results were very clear. At first, we looked at a multifactorial analysis. As I said, we have 3 data points from each sample, 1 from the measurement in lab, then the second data point is from the first session of the replication that still took place in the lab, and the remaining measurements in the home profiling of the replication are our third data point. We can see that the location of all 3 measures from one sample are clustered together. This similar location in the map and the RV score, a coefficient indicating the similarity, which is for home profiling versus lab always above 0.9, indicated a similar profile assessment in home and in lab. As a second step, we looked at the discrimination between the products. On the second map of this slide, the PCA, we could prove that the distance between the center of the map and the samples is equally good in home and in lab. The panelists were, even in home profiling with a lower standardization, able to describe the products very similar to the lab, and also the discrimination between the products was equally good. Taking a closer look in detail, I will show you the results of a random product out of the sample set, only with a comparison of the first lab and the second home evaluation. We can see that the profiles of the 2 measurements almost match perfectly, especially in odor, flavor, and aftertaste, the purple blocks. Differences that we discover are in the appearance and the texture and mouthfeel attributes. Slight appearances and texture differences result from the non-standardized light and temperature conditions at home. So, our conclusion is yes, we can trust the data from home profiling, given the samples are suitable for home profiling, the project is well planned beforehand, exact instructions for sample treatment and tasting are shared with the panelists, and the panelists show high engagement. But there are also a few limitations in home profiling. We cannot 100% control the home environment of the panelists, including temperature, room order, and light conditions. Testing under red light in general is hard to arrange in home profiling. And of course, there are samples that are not suitable for home profiling. For example, samples that require an immediate tasting after preparation. So, in the future, we will not always see it necessary to stick to the highly standardized lab profiling and believe there can be test scenarios where home profiling might be a better approach, cost and time-wise. We see the advantage in both setups. In lab, there is no direct link to the context. Products are tested in a neutral environment, independent from a certain situation or context. Thus, we are generating general data. If product perception strongly depends on a context, for example for skincare products, home profiling can deliver a more fitting data. Lab profiling delivers a high internal validity. This highly standardized sample preparation across panelists and samples ensures that the differences between products are discovered. Highly external validity is achieved by home profiling. It allows for natural variation in preparation and presentation of the products. Here we could also include the measurement of the preparation, for example during cooking an entire meal. In-lab is very efficient for standard protocols, as samples are prepared and served by lab assistants. Thus, profiling of many samples is more efficient. In-home can be more efficient for special occasions, meaning for monadic profiling of just one sample or over a longer time span, the home approach can be time and cost saving. So, I hope this excursion into the world of home profiling answered you a few questions and lifted some of the concerns you might have had on the quality of results captured in home profiling. I will now hand back to Carol, who will guide us through the question and answer part. Thank you everyone for listening.
Well, thank you so much, all of you, for such an interesting and topical presentation. We're now moving on to today's Q&A session. And just a reminder, you can submit questions using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And the first one I have is for Phiala. So Phiala, are the panel dynamics different at home compared to working in the sensory lab?
There was kind of a warming up period over the first couple of days of that all settling down. And in truth, I think that was more about interaction with the software, because a lot of our panelists had never really used something like Teams before, which is why we did an earlier move home and kind of get over that hurdle, because the last thing in the world we wanted was that we were measuring, panelist interactions with the soft and the hardware rather than their the actual products. But no is the long-term answer with that. I mean, it helped in some ways because there's more opportunity to allow people that are a bit quieter to talk. But we've very quickly just flicked back into the old dynamics. I know that talking with other people that have moved panels home, they've gone through that same curve. So, as I say, I don't think it's so much dynamics as more to do with just learning the new software, the new situation, and then it all goes back to, I'm going to say normal, but I think I need parentheses around that.
New normal.
New normal.
Okay. That's great. Thank you. So I'll move on to a question for Jean. Jean, if a larger consumer base size is likely to be required for a home use test compared to a central location test, is it possible to give some idea of typically how much larger?
Yes. Well, I don't think there's a one single answer to that question, because there's a lot of variables, which to some extent is normal when you design any test. I would say, for example, if your product doesn't have much within product variation moving to the home use, maybe up from 100 to 120 consumers.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you were going to something like a monadic test from a sequential monadic, then you may end up having to increase to say 150 or more. So really you're sort of looking at your variation and how many more consumers you need to accommodate that to find a difference that you need to do.
Okay, yeah, that's very clear. Thank you. And let's see, I've got a question now for Annika. So Annika, which product categories did you find were suitable, or do you think are suitable for home use testing, and where did you face limitations in your work?
Most categories were very easy to move to home use testing. For example, all kinds of skincare or health products, chewing gum, all kinds of cold beverages, dairy products, spreads, but also, for example, cigarettes. But there were also a few categories that were more challenging. And there we faced more the trouble of the general tasting or serving condition than the product itself. So for example, if you have a product that needs to be tasted immediately after the preparation, this is a little bit challenging if the products are prepared in lab and cannot be prepared by the panelists themselves. So for example, we had a project of whipped cream that needed to be prepared and tasted within 5 minutes. This was a little bit hard to achieve. Or also further limiting factors are if you need to prepare or if you need equipment to prepare the products, for example, coffee machines that you cannot send to the panelists at home, or if, for example, when you have hot beverages, usually if you can keep the products warm for a longer time, the panelists can pick up the products and taste them at home. But if you cannot keep them long over a longer period, then it's harder to move these products to home profiling.
Oh, okay. That's very useful explanation. Thank you very much. So there's so many questions. Thank you, everyone, for some great questions here. I'm going to try and touch on as many as I can. One of them is probably most relevant for Phiala and Annika. It's in-home profiling. How are term generation discussions done? How are they handled? And I can add on to that any specific software that's helpful. So it's a lot of questions, but really it's about training.
Got a headset and a mic. There is a little bit of that, but that's not too bad. But what we're actually finding is that for quite a lot of discussion sessions, they are easier, ironically, to be done at home, because if everyone's in separate rooms, you haven't got any feedback issues or any of those complications going on. And also the panel are now used to those dynamics. But either way, it works. And it isn't a lot different to how you would normally do it. I mean, the complication, as Annika was also saying, is getting the samples to the panel, but it's the same type of thing. It's the same, presenting the samples, panel scoring, discussion. It's not a lot different. You've just got to get over that hurdle of the interaction with the software.
Do you have any further comments, Annika?
No, yes, we can also agree that it's sometimes a little bit easier over Teams, for example, because you have these little gadgets where you can ask questions to the panelists, and then not everyone answers in their own words, but you can get a really quick question. And if you do some term generation, they can write the answers down in the chat, and then you can collect it a little bit better. So it's working really nice for us as well.
Before I move on, can I ask something that I've wondered personally about? Usually during a vocabulary generation session, I would use a whiteboard or flipboard. Have you found any software apps or tools that allow you to do something like that remotely?
I mean, we do all sorts of things. I mean, because you've got that function to be able to share your screen, we've done all sorts of things. I mean, in fact, it's made us think in some cases, why on earth weren't we doing this in the lab? Because it was possible in the lab, but we can then, you can then show data in real time coming in, so panelists can see what's going on. You can create documents in front of their eyes, create charts in front of their eyes. And again, this is all the additional probing that you can actually get by panelists starting to see some of the outputs that you're generating. So we've actually found, and I think looking at Annika nodding, that actually that's improved a lot of the ways we work, just through that ability to share screens, people capturing their questions in the question box before they forget them. And then also, of course, it's all permanent. You've got it all. You can go back through all the questions and check that you've now, when you're writing the report, that comment that, I don't know, Fred said on day 2 was a good one. Have you got it in the report?
Okay, great. So Jean, I have a question for you. Can you please explain the cost activity difference between in-lab and in-home profiling? Well, I think this is for you, Jean. So it's really a question about costs. Do you foresee differences in costs between lab and home profiling, or is...
Right, I think it's probably more appropriate for Annika and Phiala if we're talking about profiling.
Okay.
I mean, I would probably say at the minute, going in home will be more expensive. But I think once people get the logistics sorted out, I think it should come back to the same type of cost. But I think Phiala, Annika probably got more experience.
Okay, true. Can I open that up then?
Yeah, sure. So for us, it really depends on the product category. For example, if you have a product, a hot dish, for example, where the panelists can only evaluate 2 products at home because they need to keep the temperature, it's of course more pricey than a test what you can do in lab where they can evaluate 10 products after each other. So this is a difference, but on the other hand, there are also projects that can be cheaper. For example, if you have a project on chewing gum where they evaluate over half an hour, you can tell them, okay, do 1 session in the morning, 1 session in the evening, for example, where on the other hand, if they had to come in the lab, you would have a lot more time in between and you cannot be as efficient as you can be at home.
Yep, I completely agree with that. We found that particularly in the beginning, it was a little bit more expensive because we were tending for all sorts of COVID purposes. We were actually having quite complicated delivery processes using couriers that we'd got to apply the COVID rules and regulations. But now that the lockdown has lifted, so the panelists are, well, they're starting to come back to work anyway, they can then pick up sample as well. So we're finding that's all now becoming even. And exactly to Annika's point, if you've got a project that's got a complicated makeup, it's probably going to cost more anyway. Those costs might be a little bit elevated at home, but it's not a big difference.
Okay, no, that's really clear. And I think a lot of our listeners will appreciate that discussion. So, Jean, I'm going to try another one that should be more relevant for you. This is about if you can't afford to increase the consumer base size moving to a home use test, as per the first question. What do you think about moving from a 95 to 90% confidence level when you're looking at concluding if samples are significantly different?
I mean, it's certainly possible. And again, it comes down to your test objective and what you're going to do with the results. So something like, say, an exploratory test where you're looking at maybe some prototypes and you want to get these initial findings, then I think moving to 90%, for example, you're still getting directional trends. And even going down, I think some companies use small-scale consumer guidance testing, which might go down to maybe 85%. For me, the key is about managing risk. 95, 90% is not like a golden bullet. It's about managing risk against the objectives. So pulling in your interpretation, is the same story being told by multiple attributes on your questionnaire? Do you have any contradictions? So I think, yes, by all means, go down the confidence level, but remember, you need to manage the risk and ensure your interpretation accounts for that.
No, and that makes a lot of sense, isn't it? So evaluate your actual context and look at the risks. Okay, great. Thank you. In terms of sensory panels or even consumer panels, so maybe this is a question for all of you. Doing remote testing and testing at home, does it mean there's a possibility for panels to be made up of geographically dispersed panelists or consumers? Would there be any benefit of that?
Yes, I mean, the answer is that yes, of course you can do that because we've found that this all works. I mean, the complication for doing that with a panel would be sample, getting it to them. I mean, with a sensory panel, well, I'd question the need for doing that. We've done a lot of work at MMR showing that our panels generate very similar data, whether they're based in Shanghai or New York, because of the methodologies we work towards, the protocols we adhere to. So sensory panels, as the reason we have panels around the world is mainly to do with some very practical issues. How do you get product A into China, or rather out of China or into another place? So we've got geographical panels around the world to sort some of those problems out. It's not particularly because we want a panel specifically with that geographical bent to them. So for panels, it's yes. I mean, the answer is yes, but then you need to ask, why do you want to do that?
Okay. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I would say maybe for home use testing, having the consumers dispersed could be an advantage to get a more representative sample. So CLT, you tend to to a specific location to keep it cost effective. Same cost as post out samples having delivered. So I think it could be a benefit.
Okay, great. Here's an interesting one about, but back on the training theme. Does anyone have experience of integrating? So I guess this is more for Annika and Phiala. Do either of you have any experience of integrating new panelists into home panel situations? So if they haven't previously worked in a lab, it's just the fact that the questioner says COVID is not going away soon, so we might need to recruit new panelists in this context.
We had, when lockdown happened, we had a panelist that had been with us a very short period of time, so there was a bit more support that person needed, and confidence building as well, because they couldn't, it's not quite the same as sitting next to the table, and when you don't quite know what you're supposed to be doing, have a panelist colleague lean over and say, oh, it's that sample, we're scoring this lot of attributes. So they needed more support with that. But the other trick we found quite useful with what with our panel leader in the UK is doing is when we have the session, in between the blocks of projects, she obviously wants to go away and shut down what file she's got, get a headset into the next project. Then she just left the setup open, the Teams open, and they just chatted and gossiped and talked as normal. And I think that is actually incredibly important, because a lot of the dynamics with the panel are based on understanding personalities. So I think if we're going to need to be integrating new people in, you do need to have that social element in those sessions to enable them to understand the other panelists, how to interact with them, to acquire those soft skills which are fundamentally important to being a panelist.
Yeah.
And also when you either set up a new panel or integrate panelists and need to train them on a method, for example, it's really helpful to have really a camera with them, that you can really standardize all the different steps that they need to do and really make sure that they understood and can follow it.
Yep. Okay. And I can see personally, if you're training from scratch, I guess the logistics of getting the samples to them can be really important as well, because training can involve lots of samples, can't it?
It can, and don't forget the references as well, because you have to get all your references to the panel. So it's fine if they're ambient stable and can go in the post. Slightly more tricky if it's yogurt, at day 2 of its aging process. So yeah, neither of us, Annika and I, have spoken about that. I suppose that gets bundled into it's an awful lot of work sending samples home statement.
Yeah, yeah. Here's a really interesting question. This is directed to Phiala and Annika, but of course, Jean, if you have any thoughts, shout out. If there's a need for the QDA panel to evaluate carbonated beverages which have very big color differences, how would you manage that with home profiling? And how would you manage the carbonation part?
The difference is actually that's not as difficult as it sounds, and we've had that. That's all about blinding bottles, so that you can't see it in the bottles. Now, of course, when you're pouring them out, you've got slightly more complications with that. So we in one particular area, we used quite deep, dark glasses, so that drinking glasses as opposed to glasses themselves, so that it went into those, so that would mask some of the differences. And then also, not with my project, but another project actually did use glasses as well. So in that particular project, they were using red glasses. So the panelists then, actually these were consumers, but the same problem, were then pouring products out of bottles that were blinded into cups that were deep and dark and wearing glasses. So they probably looked quite comical whilst they were doing it. But it's all about managing what you can manage, and what Annika and I are really saying is that with all these problems, we're still not seeing massive impacts in the data. So if you've got a very well trained panel, some of these what appear to be showstoppers at the beginning aren't showstoppers, and there's usually a workaround.
Yeah. Any further thoughts, Annika?
Yeah, this is also what we've experienced is for home use testing also is one of the limitations that we sometimes have is that you need a higher product amount compared to lab testing. So for example, if you have a can of beverage that you test in lab, you can split it over 5 panelists. And when you set it home, usually everyone needs a larger amount. So this was more a tricky part, getting the exact amounts compared to how can we blind this at home.
But this is where also the user experience comes in, because once you've now got your bottle and they are now opening it, then there's the sounds of that, the ease of opening it, how it pours out. That pain where you get some bottles where the lip isn't designed correctly, so they don't come out smoothly. Well, all of a sudden you can capture all of that because the panelists are now seeing something which they would normally be, almost artificially removed from. So this is a case of when you've got situations like that, also thinking what else can you get out of it, because they're now handling those products, you can get a lot more out of it.
Yeah. Okay. So this is where we kind of move into the innovate.
Completely.
Yeah. Oh, here's another very interesting question. Again, probably more based at Phiala and Annika. Have you used portable booths at home? And if so, how useful were they?
We've not, but we are now working in partnership with a French company who do the kind of the lab in the bag type things. So I think, can I have a month or so, and then I'll come back to you and answer that in much more detail.
Yeah, we neither. So we have not used portable labs or booths to send home to the panelists, but I don't know how it was for everyone here, but in Germany, the regulations were not as strict. The people were still allowed to go outside, and we had set up one mobile booth in the entrance of one of our labs, so that the panelists did not have to enter really the lab itself. They just entered the first door, and there we could do individual profiling. So people came in for a certain time slot, did their profiling, and then we disinfected everything, and then the next person could come in. But we did not send any cabin booth home.
Well, I've written that down, Annika. I like that idea. I'm having it.
Well, this is an interesting question. It's a kind of more general question, taking a step back with the whole COVID-19 situation and some people being on furlough and some people working and having a mixture of people coming back and things like that. Do you have any tips in general how to recreate the kind of panel spirit when people have been working disparately or not everyone's been working and they're then coming back?
I think that goes back a bit to my social question. I mean, we at MMR we've maintained not just for the panels but social setups, times for teams to chat, and that, I mean, if I think just of my UK team, who are anyway quite disparate because they're in different places all around the UK, some of those softer sessions are, we have our sensory socials on a Friday sort of late afternoon, where we kind of have a work talk ban, and that pool, I mean, inevitably work slips in, but that actually has been very good for maintaining team bonding. And again, same with the panels, those tricks that my panel leader was doing of, stepping out of the discussion, turning her microphone and her video off and going off, preparing for the next session, allowing the panel to maintain that social side, all fundamentally important to keeping the team spirit going. Even for furloughed people, having them involved.
Yeah, and we experienced also that the panelists were really very happy that we kept on going with the profiling, because many of them couldn't go to work anymore, or were stuck at home, and we're really happy to have a little bit of a something to do at least during this time, and keep going with the panel. So there was already a high motivation, and yeah, we did the same. So we kept we started the panels a little bit earlier, or left them open a little bit longer, so they could interact a little bit afterwards to have the social component.
I'm smiling because I'm remembering delivering some product to one of the panelists when we got to the point where we could go out and deliver ourselves reasonably because we weren't breaking lockdown rules. One of the panelists ran out the house and just about to hug me because she was going, "Oh God, I've missed everybody. When can we go back?" And then realised that actually social distancing we can't. So yeah, Annika, all our panelists are very appreciative that the jobs kept going. Appreciative that they've realised they are very lucky to be in a job where they're going to talk with their teams every single day. And I think if anything, it's brought us all closer together, not put us further apart.
Well, that's really nice to hear.
Thinking about that in terms of consumers and the social context, irrespective of CLT home use, if, for example, you normally consume in a pub or you normally consume in a restaurant, going forward, is the possibility to have virtual rooms. They're still socially distanced, but you're in that social context that you'd normally be in. And I think there's a few studies where virtual rooms have been used and are shown to be more aligned to real life compared to either home use or a CLT.
Oh, that's a really interesting thought. So more kind of personalized settings. Yeah, interesting. Okay, just checking. We've got maybe time for one more question. Yes, this one kind of relates back to the panel again. And the question is, did you give, so it's for Annika, did you give extra provisions or extra payment to panelists for use of their own home facilities?
We at Easy, we did not the panel because usually our sessions were a little bit shorter than normal, and in case we had we sent the products home, they did not have the time they usually have to come to our building and to go back home, and so for us it was all in the same in the cost they usually had. We did not do any extra payments.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. So there's so many really good questions. Thank you, everyone. And thanks everyone from around the globe for attending the webinar. Unfortunately, we won't have time to go through all of them, but you're able to contact the speakers directly with your questions if they haven't been answered. And their details are now on the screen. And finally, we'd like you to remind you of those who aren't actually familiar with the IFST, that you can find some useful resources on the IFST website. For example, there's a COVID-19 Knowledge Hub, and there's the online Food Science and Technology magazine. And we welcome new members, so please check out the membership benefits page on the IFST website. And I also wanted to just quickly say, if you enjoyed this webinar, there's another one coming up in the Sensory Science Group series. So keep an eye out for the IFST events page about that. So finally, I just want to say thank you so much, Phiala, Jean, and Annika, and everyone for attending today, and Robin, who's in the background organizing the webinar. It's been really great to have all of you here. Thank you.